To Broadband Breakfast Live Online for Wednesday, May 18th, 2022. I'm Drew Clark, editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast. Very excited to welcome our guest here to talk about the next step of broadband infrastructure, and in particular to talk about the U.S. Treasury Department's Capital Project Fund. But before we get to that, I just want to remind everyone just who Broadband Breakfast is and what we do. We are a news publication and event community. We are focused on better broadband, better lives. That's our mantra. That's our raison d'existence. I'm slaughtering my French there. And what we're trying to do is bring people together around how we get higher capacity broadband and what we do with it to make sure everyone is connected, everyone's able to be online and take advantage of tools. We want to encourage you to be a part of our community at Broadband Breakfast and to join in the conversation, the dialogue that we are participating in and contributing over at Broadband.money, one of our sponsoring organizations. Broadband.money has a community and is focused on helping people get the information they need for applying for broadband grants. And we've been very focused on the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, but also the other aspects of broadband funding. And I'll be interviewing Brian Vo of Connect Humanity this Friday. And next Tuesday in Keystone, Colorado, I have the privilege of welcoming once again National Telecommunications and Information Administration administrator Alan Davidson to the Mountain Connect conference. We had him here in Washington just 4 weeks ago at our Broadband Breakfast for lunch. We have another very important government official with us here today, and we'll be talking about a slightly different broadband fund, but nonetheless important and in fact live right now. Two other quick notes before I introduce our guest and we dive into our conversation. I want to remind you that we will be here next Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern time, as we are every Wednesday, with a session. I'll be out in Colorado still, so we'll have other folks from Mountain Connect talking about broadband funding. And then the following week, we'll be talking about broadband mapping. That's June 1st. And then on June 8th, we will be back at Clyde's of Gallery Place for an in-person sit-down with Christopher McLean. Christopher is the Rural Utilities Service Administrator. So we're going to get everyone, right? We had Alan, we have our guest here who I'll introduce just now, and we'll have Christopher McLean working on someone over at the FCC as well, but stand by for more details on that. And then on on June 15th, we will be talking from Fiber Connect in Nashville, Tennessee. And the other quick notice announcement, I want to make sure to give a shout out to all of our sponsors. They include Utopia Fiber, Broadband.money, Broadband Now, Powerhouse Management, Lightbox, Ookla, Samsung, Positron Access, Connect the Future, and the California Emerging Technology Fund. We appreciate all of you for your help in making sure we can do this program every week. All right, with that, let me go ahead and introduce our guest. This is Joseph Wender, or Joey Wender. He is the director of the U.S. Department of the Treasury's Capital Projects Fund. And just to kick that off extremely briefly, we had one item on Broadband Breakfast last Friday. It was about the new memorandum of understanding signed by the Federal Communications Commission, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration of Commerce, and new signer, the U.S. Department of Treasury. There had been an MOU for those three agencies on broadband and coordination, but now the Treasury Department joined in on that. So that seems to be something new. And so for that, I'm going to turn to Joseph Wender to say just a little bit about the U.S. Treasury Department's role in broadband funding. And is this kind of a short-term thing, Joey, or is this kind of, are we going to see the Treasury Department in for the long haul?
So Drew, first, let me thank you for inviting me onto the breakfast during lunch. I understand the alliteration would not work if it was breakfast lunch. So it's broadband breakfast, I get it. And it's been fun watching a bunch of people. I see a bunch of names I know that have popped on to this call. So hello to everybody to wherever you are right now. The short answer to your initial question before I dive into describing our program and where we are right now is that's Congress's decision to whether Treasury is in the broadband business in the long haul or not. In the American Rescue Plan, Congress decided to give $10 billion to Treasury to start up a broadband program. I'll leave the reasons why to the authors of the program, but nonetheless, we are here. We are now become a big player in broadband, and in recognizing that, I'm glad, Drew, you noticed last week we have now signed on to an MOU, a memorandum of understanding, with the other three agencies in the broadband business. Voluntarily have done so because Treasury recognizes that we do need to be coordinating with our other federal partners. We want to make sure that we are sharing reporting data and that we're doing this in a holistic manner in order to achieve the broader administration's goal of closing the digital divide and connecting all the unconnected in the United States. The FCC, AG, NTIA, and Treasury, we all have our roles to play in that larger goal.
Well, thanks for indulging that introductory question. I know you want to talk about the capital projects funds. You actually have a PowerPoint here, which I'm going to share right now. As I do so, I just want to remind all of those who are watching, not just on Zoom, but we're streaming this on Broadband Breakfast, on YouTube, on Facebook and Twitter. We have obviously been closely following the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which is a $65 billion pool of money, at least 45 billion of which are being administered by NTIA. And last Friday, 5 days ago, 3 notices of funding opportunity dropped. Again, you can read all about this on Broadband Breakfast as well as on broadband.money. And these NOFOs lay out the details, including the timelines, okay? And many of them are still quite far in the future, right? But this 45 billion that NTIA is administering, plus about 20 billion that the Federal Communications Commission has through the Affordable Connectivity Program, makes up that $65 billion pool. But there's much more, right? And that's really where Treasury comes in, the American Recovery Plan Act, ARPA. I'm sorry, I always mess that one up.
The American Rescue Plan. There are too many. We should have an acronym-free zone, by the way.
Well, we try to be that, Joey. We try to be acronym-free zone, and I may call you if you do one we haven't defined. but let's go ahead. I'm going to screen share the application here, which has our presentation. So go ahead, Joey, and
great. You can obviously go to the next slide.
All righty.
So there was a time in Washington where $10 billion would have made you the most popular program or the biggest program in town. Now, obviously, NTIA has been appropriated much more than that. But this $10 billion that capital projects have, in many ways, is the tip of the spear on the administration's goal of closing the digital divide. And our money is going to be filling in gaps now. And as we'll get to the timeline in a second. And I think you're going to have a huge impact on building out affordable, reliable, high-speed internet today and tomorrow. And, think of sort of waves crashing on the beach. Our wave is first, and then there are subsequent waves coming, including all the money that Drew just discussed at NTIA. And so with that, I'm going to go a little bit more into detail on the capital projects fund. So it's $10 billion to states, territories, freely associated states, and tribes to invest in capital projects. Now, every state already knows how much it's been allocated. So we'll be clear, this is not a competitive grant program in the sense that Maryland competes with Massachusetts, competes with Maine. Every state knows what they're going to get. It's somewhere between about $100 million on the low end to just over $500 million for the state of California. Now, there are 3 presumptively eligible uses for our funds. One is broadband infrastructure, which we expect to be the lion's share of the funding. Second are digital connectivity technologies. So those are device programs or public Wi-Fi. And then finally, multi-purpose community facilities. Again, places that can bring connectivity to communities for enabling work, education, and health monitoring. So let's go to the next slide.
So those, of course, are on that bottom of the slide there, the three icons: infrastructure, activities, and facilities. I assume you'll get to case-by-case reviews, but that was not one of the three big buckets.
They're not presumptively eligible.
Got it. Okay.
Right. If you fit in those three categories, you're presumptively eligible.
Very good. Next slide. I'm going to. There we go.
Great. So again, this is rescue plan money. So it was appropriated in March of 21. So we have a charge to get this money out soon, on a quick timeline in order to help us recover from the pandemic. And so where are we in the process? Well, we're essentially running two different programs here. One is for states, the other is for tribes. I'll touch very briefly on tribes and then go into more detail on states. But for tribes, we've actually already made almost 36 awards already. As we've received applications in and reviewed them as whether they're presumptively eligible in the three categories that I outlined before, we've already been approving tribal applications. When it comes to states, our portal's been open since early this year, and we've received over a dozen state program plans where they have told us exactly how they intend to spend our money. We have been reviewing those plans. We've been iterating back and forth with states, and we expect to make our first awards to those first states in a matter of weeks, potentially days. We are very, very close to making announcements on those first states. And you should think about our application process like college admissions. It's rolling. So the sooner the states apply, the sooner we can review them, the sooner we can go back and forth, because obviously no application is perfect when it comes in, though we hope they are. And there are always obviously questions that need to be asked. And we're to the point now with a few states where we're near signing on the dotted line and sending them and proving their plan and setting them to work. So we have been encouraging states to apply sooner than later so we can get this money moving. I like to say that usually states are waiting on Washington. In our case, it's Washington waiting on states. The money is there, and states know exactly how much they've been allocated. So we're encouraging states, come in, apply, tell us how you intend to. Let's get this money approved. Let's start the build out. And again, it goes as a nice sequence to our money goes out first, and then you'll figure out and think about how to holistically use the NTIA money next. So let's go to the next slide. All right, use of funds. So here, I'm only going to be talking about broadband because that's the majority of the funds, and I'm sure that's obviously the interest, the majority interest on this call. So we have a design build standard, and it's 100 symmetrical. Let me say that again. We're paying for 100 symmetrical speeds. Clearly, we have put our thumb on the scale in favor of fiber. The idea is to create, or to fund, I should say, future-proof connections that don't just last for years, but last for decades. The other key component or requirement of our funds is that any ISP who receives funding must participate in the ACP, the Affordability Program at the FCC. Now, in light of the extremely exciting announcement at the White House a couple weeks ago, where you've got most ISPs committing to not only participating in the ACP, but providing plans of $30 a month, we think that this requirement is quite easy for most to make. But I just want to say that we are at Treasury extremely proud of supporting the FCC's work on the ACP. And that's why it's one of our key components or our key requirements here. Moving down the list, we encourage states to solicit bids from everybody. That's incumbents, that's competitors, that's munis, that's co-ops. Clearly, we are addressing what is a market failure in a lot of places. There's a reason why there's many people in this country, millions or potentially there's tens of millions of people that do not have affordable, reliable, high-speed internet. And so, we're subsidizing the build out of new networks or improving existing networks. And, we want to see the maximum amount of potential players to bid on these projects to win and then to efficiently build them out. Let's go to the next slide. I'm just kidding. That was the last slide. I see I got Drew there. That was pretty good.
You did.
That was good. That was a great little move.
Yeah.
So that's the short on our program. Sorry, Drew. That was too easy. I'm a pretty good poker player. So you did not read my face well. So, with that, Drew, why don't you ask me some questions, and I'm happy to take questions from the audience.
Well, absolutely, and we do appreciate not only you being here, but the audience who's attending on multiple platforms. If you're attending via Zoom, you can ask your questions. I should also be able to see questions on the other platforms too, if you'd like to pose them on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. So let me just start off, Joe, by going back to you called it, I guess, the cycling of funds through programs, right? And you mentioned extremely briefly ARPA, the American Rescue Plan Act. I think I got that one right this time. ARPA funds, Treasury's capital projects funds here, and of course IIJA. So could you just speak briefly about how you've seen ARPA funds utilized? Those were, of course, back in the earlier days of the pandemic, and again how these capital project fund dollars either use or could use ARPA funds, and then likewise how capital project fund and ARPA funds can be used, for example, as a match fund in IIJA. Could you speak to those issues, Joey?
Sure, lots to unpack there. 3 pots of money that people should be thinking about here. And I'm going to have to correct, I don't like to correct the moderator, but I have to correct him a little bit. Technically, capital projects money are also ARPA money.
Okay.
So when you're talking about ARPA, the American Rescue Plan, there's two funds. Well, there's a lot of funds that were under that plan. It was a multi-trillion-dollar bill. But the 2 that affect broadband are the state and local fiscal relief program, which was the $350 billion that, if you recall, went out to states and localities to plug up their budgets. As we all remember, there was huge shortfalls at the time because the pandemic, crashed us into a recession and crashed funding and spending. Within that $350 billion, one of the eligible uses of the funds, amongst a lot of different uses, hundreds of different uses, is broadband build-outs. And we know that, and we're going to have more particular numbers soon, that in the billions have been committed from that funding to spend on broadband. Now, remember, that money went to both states and localities. Then you've got the Capital Projects Fund, which I'm the director of. Though obviously I have a window into the state and local, the SLFRF, as we call it at Treasury, the state and local fund, because I'm sitting obviously at Treasury now. We have $10 billion to spend on capital projects, and as I said earlier, that's more of a broadband program, right? The presumptively eligible uses are broadband, devices to connect to broadband, or multipurpose community centers, which improve connectivity in a community. In our case, the money goes directly to states. And states decide how to spend the money. So for example, we haven't approved any plans, but I could give a sneak peek at how we think that a lot of the money will be spent. Our money is going to flow directly into state competitive grant programs. So some states already have programs in place. The state legislature or elsewhere has funded, build out in the state. Our money is going to likely be dumped right into that program with our requirements flowing with it in order to further identify places in the state that are unconnected, and then they'll do the build out. Then there's the NTIA money. So does that answer the question, Drew?
And could you just address the match part of that question as well?
How have
ARPA funds, I guess we got to think of a friendly name for the state and local.
Oh, it's the worst acronym ever. It's absolutely awful. SLFRF. State and local. It's the state and local relief funds.
All right. So you clarified that the state and local relief fund as part of ARPA, right? And Treasury's capital projects funds also part of ARPA.
They could all be blended. Your answer to your questions, they could be blended.
Okay. So in other words, it's basically a blank check or a clear slate. Let's not use that phrase. It's a clean opportunity to use ARPA funds as a match for IIJA funds. Is that the answer?
It is, with a caveat. We have a 5-year deadline on spending our dollars. We can be honest that we know that the maps that the NTIA money are based on, Secretary Armando said November. That was publicly what she said last week. And then we know there will be a challenge process. And so our advice to states is, because there's a 5-year deadline in using our funds, and it's already been a year, so there's only 4 left, on using the funds. Remember, these are COVID relief money. Don't wait on the NTIA funds. Our recommendation is think of them as complementary. You're looking at your whole state, and you're looking at all of your holes and the places in which you want to build out. You should think about our money and think about the NTIA money as you make a plan for the whole state. But given the build out requirements, I would encourage states not to wait. Right? You can see though how the work that you do with our money can complement extending networks and doing this in a holistic way with the money you'll eventually get from Commerce.
So I've got more questions, but we're starting to get a good bit of questions here. So I'm going to go ahead and start with a question that we have here from James Renard. Are states required to turn in at least one actual project with their initial capital projects fund plan to receive approval? Is that the case, Joey?
Oh, yes, they have to submit a program plan. Right, they have to tell us how they intend to spend the money. But that being said, we already have a state who has come in and applied for half their money, and we know they intend to come in the fall for the other half of their money because they're waiting on the state legislature to approve the second half.
Mm-hmm. So just to restate something you've already said, it's just worth mentioning. The recipients of your funds, capital projects funds, are just states, right? Yep. States and territories. That is the same effectively for IIJA. It's the states that will be receiving the funds. There will be sub-grantees of states, but so with this kind of state-driven focus of both of these aspects, again, yes. there's a couple programs on the periphery that don't operate that way, Joey, right? But for the most part, we've just talked about $45 billion from IIJA and $10 billion from Treasury that are working through the states. So what are you doing, you at Treasury Department, to kind of cultivate and work with those states so that the states can have the best plan possible for what they want to do with their funds, again, cognizant of those three purposes you've laid out here?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm glad you did emphasize that our money and NTIA money does go to states. And I think that's a key point I want to make before I explain how we're working with states is, Congress has decided to give this money to states. Now there's guardrails and rules on it, but that's how Congress has designed this, is to give flexibility to states. Particularly in our program, they have quite a bit of flexibility. That's a decision that Congress made, right? As opposed to an executive agency deciding exactly, particularly where the money will be spent. We have given a lot of flexibility and discretion to governors on how this money will be spent. In terms of helping the states, and we have an outstanding outreach team led by Jeff Searle, who used to run North Carolina's broadband office, and he's got a terrific team that goes out and speaks almost weekly to every single state. We have someone on our staff who is the point of contact for every state. So every state knows who to come to on Treasury as they ask questions, go through our guidance, and try to understand exactly what they need to do and submit to us in order to get approved. The other thing is that we closely work with NTIA. We presented at their State Broadband Leaders Network conference earlier this year, because ultimately NTIA and us, we're talking to the same individual within the state and making sure that they are thinking about all of these investments and deployments in a holistic manner.
So thanks for mentioning that state leaders network. That's a crucial group. I kind of, claim membership from my early days. I was the state broadband initiative director in Illinois in version 1.0 when we had the Recovery Act of 2009. Obviously, things have improved and we've got a much more resources now available. But nonetheless, states are playing that crucial role in coordinating, and that's obviously something that needs to be cultivated, and states need to be thinking, okay, I don't want to just think about IIJA, I want to be thinking about my capital project fund allocation.
Absolutely.
What percentage of states have any kind of gotten all their money thus far, Joey, or like where?
We have not, let me be clear, I said this earlier, we have not approved any state plans, but we are extremely close to making our first announcements.
Right, but again, without revealing names of who's coming, when you do that tranche of announcement, will that kind of tap out some states or
yes.
Okay. All right. So
some states, a lot of states have come in asking for their full amounts.
Okay.
And some have not. I think that's, that's going to be a key feature of this. And I think it's the question that some are asking is that because we've given flexibility to the states and we've given such broad authority to states are going to do this different. Some are going to come in hot, quick. They have a very sophisticated plan and an excellently thought out broadband plan and a well-functioning broadband office, and they're going to act fast. On the other side of the spectrum, there's going to be some states that are going to struggle to come up with a plan. Right. And that's part of our job, is we think of it as a partnership with each state and a partnership with all of you, whether, your advocates or providers or anybody else, to help states along and get to a place of being able to deploy to the unconnected.
Joey, have you mentioned the match requirement for capital project funds dollars? There's a 25% floor on the match requirements in IIJ monies.
There's no match. We have no match.
No match at all. So
no match
how does that affect things? How is that going to change your programs versus other programs because of that lack of match?
I can't speak to how it will be different from other programs. What I can say is states should be looking at our money as a flexible means of getting to those hard to reach areas and those places that have historically been unserved. right? Without a match requirement. And again, there's no match requirement in part because this is COVID money. This is COVID relief money, and under the assumption that states and were really struggling at the time. So that's why there was no match put on.
Thanks for that clarification. We have a question from Francine Alkaswani. Could you talk a bit about the multi-purpose community facilities? That was the third of the three, and talk in a little bit on the digitally connective technologies too, Joey.
Sure. So I'll start with devices and digital technologies. And look, and Drew didn't mention, I worked for Ed Markey for the last 10 years on the Hill, and I've been on the Hill for the last 13 years up until when I went to Treasury 5 months ago. So I'm quite aware of the fact there's been a lot of interest in essentially device programs, right? I mean, you could see that with E-rate, which I've worked on a lot, and the emergency connectivity funds, the need not only to bring connectivity to people's homes, but give them the means through which to access the internet. And so states can use our money to set up device programs to be loaning out to low-income individuals and communities in need. They're also allowed to do public Wi-Fi networks in places where they can identify that there's a real community need and lack of accessibility. On the multi-purpose community center side, it's got to be a facility that directly enables remote work, education, and health monitoring. It's got to be able to do all three, not one, not two, all three. And so think, it's got to be, a true community center or potentially a library, something that's publicly facing, publicly accessible, and is put in a community in need and that a state identifies as needing that type of resource.
Just repeat those three things that it needs to do again, all three of those.
Education, work, health monitoring.
Okay. Great question, Francine. Thank you for that. More questions from folks about how states are required to solicit input from municipalities. And because again, that's a theme in the IIJA NOFO, but also about any requirements of state leaders to include voices from communities on their plans and programs. So what kind of consultation and community engagement is part of this?
States are required to, in their plans, to detail out how they're doing community engagement. We have in fact gotten from a state, essentially didn't answer the question, and we have sent it back to the state and said, no, you have to detail that out. Right? How are you engaging with communities within your state? How many listening sessions have you done? What data have you crunched in order to determine that there's need in X or Y place? That's a very important component to us because equity is important. We need to be focusing on communities in need, but we need to be doing it in an equitable way.
So just specifically, what do they need to do? What do they need to show in their applications? What will you send an application back for not doing?
Right. I mean, if they essentially don't answer the question, right? There are many different ways in which they can detail out how they're doing this direct community engagement. But they can't simply say, trust us. Right, or we'll make sure that we're serving the most needy areas. Like, explain to us your rationale, explain to us your strategy, your theory of the case on how you are addressing or how you are reaching those areas.
Mm-hmm. A question we always get in events like this is this one about much of the. We're waiting on the maps, right?
The maps.
The maps. What sort of data are you using, given that we're not going to get maps until November at the earliest? What are you doing to guide, defend decisions on allocating of funds?
Sure. Well, it's dependent upon states. And the good news is that a lot of states have a pretty good sense or have a very detailed sense on where the unconnected areas are. And so it's mostly incumbent upon states to make those decisions and work with, with carriers, with ISPs to determine that they're filling in the right holes. And our requirement is they could spend money anywhere that lacks speeds of 120.
120 or 100, 100?
120.
Okay.
That it can go anywhere that lacks that speed, 100 by 20. So we don't use the distinctions between unserved or underserved. They're allowed to go anywhere that doesn't have speeds of 100 by 20, because that's how we define in our mind high-speed internet that could support multiple people at home in 2022 running different applications.
I should say that this is an interesting point you're making, Joey. And in the interview that I conducted with Alan Davidson,
sure,
3-4 weeks ago, he emphasized that the administration is not going to be satisfied until everyone who does not have 100 by 20, that is 100 megabits per second down, 20 megabits per second up. That's the definition of underserved in the IIJA. The administration is not going to be happy until all of those unserved and underserved people. And you're making the point here that you don't really have a quote unserved definition, that 25 by 3, which most observers of this field agree is inadequate. And so maybe it appears that the IIJA guidance that we received in the NOFO is almost suggesting they're going to treat underserved as if it's unserved. Now, that may be controversial in some circles, right, on Capitol Hill and elsewhere. But could you just speak a little bit more on why I guess you're happy you don't have to deal with the 25 by 3 question, Joey?
Well, first, I agree with my friend Alan that we shouldn't stop. We should never, as an administration, have a goal of getting everybody to 25.3, right? Our goal should be at least 120. But our money, once you build out, you need to be at 100 by 100 symmetrical. So I agree with my friend that we should not rest at 25.3. Now, are we glad that, look, our statute is pretty thin, okay? Alan's statute is much more detailed, right? It's pretty, he's got some pretty explicit rules about doing this category of connections first, and second, then third. I'm not going to go into it. I will leave that to my friend to do himself. However, what our statute recognizes is that it can be efficient and effective to give states the ability to spend anywhere that lacks 120, so as to potentially avoid a real life example, Drew, is you potentially can avoid a Swiss cheese problem, right? Yeah. That you could be wiring under our money if 90% of a community or a census tract, or however you want to define it, is under 25.3, and then only a few have above that. Under our money, you don't have to skip those homes.
Right. You
can just do the whole thing. That's the most efficient way. Everybody gets a passing. So I think that's why there's a lot of excitement about our funds, that we don't have the same type of rigidity that Alan has. But again, that was Congress's decision to put those requirements on NTA's money. And it was Congress's decision not to do so, with our funds. And I don't want to say, that was Congress's decision. I'll leave it at that.
Well, and Joey, I should have introduced you and Ed Markey, who, of course, in some ways is the author of the E-rate and doing so much to make sure that those who don't have these funds to connect us with high-speed technology has access to that. And Congress, look, I wouldn't want to be one to discourage Congress from acting, because there's so many issues on which, we observers say there's no clarity when the FCC's changing its mind in every administration on issues like net neutrality. Congress should be weighing into the details to some extent. And so they have done that with IIJA. So it'd be hypocritical to say, no, Congress, you don't know what you're talking about. Brian Hooker asked a great question here. What about affordability? Many urban areas offer service, but their residents can't qualify creditworthiness or afford it. And he's tying that to the underserved, unserved conversation. So what's your reaction to Brian's question there, Joey?
I mean, Brian's right. I mean, that is an enormous concern that we have. Now, a couple of things I'll talk about on affordability. One, again, to emphasize that if an ISP does take our money, they got to participate in the ACP. I know that won't fix every single problem that you're describing, but it will have an impact. Two, again, our money could be used for public Wi-Fi, right? And so if you think about urban areas, think about places, particularly eastern states, where you might need less money to connect rural areas because there are less rural areas. You know, there should be money available potentially. I mean, I can't make anybody do anything, but certainly encourage and acknowledge that a place like DC, which has no rural areas and obviously gets a big allotment, they could spend money in public Wi-Fi.
Is there what is your reaction to Nate Smith's question about paperwork requirements on ISPs for capital projects funds grant being potentially burdensome and discouraging? What can states do to mitigate paperwork requirements?
Couple things. One, everybody on this call should know that we meet with NTIA and FCC pretty much every week in order to align our reporting requirements. And that's what the subject of the MOU is in parts. We really, this was a conversation that I had with Alan and with Jessica Rosenworcel very early when I came over, was we wanted to make sure that it was going to be apples to apples. That whatever we were collecting can, one, be fed into the fabric that the FCC is creating right now, but also two, that ISPs don't have different sets of requirements for different agencies. That is a huge commitment that I've made to ensure that we are doing this in a uniform way across agencies. And Jessica, Alan, I know Chris is going to be speaking to you from Ag in the next few weeks. Everybody agrees on that. In terms of what ISPs are going to have to report, look, we're moving towards, what I would say is we're moving towards a world, I wish we already had it, but we will have a world one day soon, fingers crossed, where there will be a map that will be maintained by the federal government of detailing out service at every location and what the speeds are. And so what we're asking for is that.
Yeah.
And I think that it's not, from my perspective, that's what ISP's business model is. All the locations you serve and the speeds at those places. And we're trying to make sure that, our reporting requirements are in concert and consistent with the rest of the agencies.
Well, it was Ed Markey who introduced the Broadband Census for America Act, and that was a inspiration for us at Broadband Census and Broadband Breakfast. James Dunstan asks the question, how are these programs going to coordinate to make sure that multiple monies don't go to the same area? And the flip side of that is, on this challenge process that you referred to, is it potentially concerning as a way for incumbents to slow down applicants who do want to build higher capacity networks where they're offering lower capacity service?
The second question I can't answer. I would let Alan answer that question because I'm not running the challenge process. On the first question, we're very explicit in our guidance that the presumption is states are not allowed to spend money in areas or at locations that have existing federal commitments, unless there's some type of additional public benefits or some type of complementary use. And so we are working with states right now to figure out exactly, where those situations or what fact patterns would allow that. But the presumption is not.
Have you released requirements for compliance and reporting requirements for your funds already?
Yes, you've outed me, Drew. They're currently they're in the Federal Register right now. So I wasn't going to advertise it because we love having comment. No, seriously, they're on the Federal Register right now. What our reporting requirements look like, and we would be, we're happy to receive comments from industry and from others on what we're asking for. But I really do believe that the elements that we're asking for are both reasonable, and I know because we talk to FCC and NTA every week, are very consistent with what ISPs are going to have to report to both other agencies.
We have just 5 minutes left with Joey Wender. So last chance to offer your questions. I'm going to try to do some rapid fire because we still have 4 or 5 more here, and we hope we'll get more. Cheryl DeBerry asks, is this money, Capital Projects Fund, allowed to cover the, quote, long driveway issue that seems prevalent in rural areas? When a home is further than a couple hundred feet, the customer must cover those costs, often in the thousands. What's your reaction? Great question, Cheryl. What's your reaction to that, Joey?
That's a great question. In fact, we were just having a conversation with the state about this. I don't have a direct answer to the question, but we are working through it with obviously the goal of connecting those individuals. Again, we have to, between our money and other monies, we're charged with getting service to every home. And so we're working through precisely that question. I literally had a call on that 2 days ago.
Question here from James Renard, follow up on the grant plan and program plan. Would Treasury be expecting specific projects in the program plan? So I hope I got your question right, James. Joey, do you want to wait?
No, James, you got the lingo down, right? The answer is no. We don't need, a state has to commit to us in a program plan of, okay, we're going to use our money. We're going to have a competitive grant program. We're going to meet 100 by 100 unless it's impractical in certain areas. We're going to require ACP participation. Obviously, we'll require all of our recipients to report, and then they get to decide exactly where within the state to plug the money. That's their decision, not ours, assuming they follow all of our requirements.
Another question from Francine Akaswani. NTIA's Office of Minority Broadband Initiatives would like to ensure that historically Black colleges and universities and other anchor institutions are key players. And she asks, how can we work with you to achieve that? Joey, what's your answer to Francine?
Well, we share that goal. You should follow up with me directly, joseph.wender@treasury.gov. And what I would say is, in the vein of avoiding a Swiss cheese problem, and as we're wiring communities, anchor institutions play a key part in connecting communities, and they can be recipients or can be connected using our funds.
So I'm going to ask as a final question, maybe it's opening a can of worms, but could you address?
No, you don't start. You can't end with the hard question.
I got it, Joey, because, and I've just sent this in the chat so people will have the access to this. My good friend Christopher Mitchell talks about the Treasury Department broadband rules, and I think he's talking about the state and local funds. Again, I recognize it's not the core capital projects fund, but since you are in the same department, could you just speak to both the criticisms that program has received, particularly from incumbents, but also, what you would say about Treasury's role overall in the broadband ecosystem, whether it's on the infrastructure side or the affordability side or the adoption use side? And we'll let you kind of close out from there, Joey.
Sure. And again, I've read Chris's piece a while back, so I can't speak directly to it. But what I will say is Treasury has a very, very important role to play right now, as I said earlier, as the tip of the spear in the administration's goal of bringing affordable, reliable, high-speed internet to all Americans. We are working very actively with our state partners and with other federal agencies to ensure our funds are used effectively, well, and for the intended results. And then for, these next waves to come ashore, and then hopefully, a few years from now, we all can look back and say, we did it. We have finished the networks. We have, sort of finished the vision. I've said in the past, it's like this is the evoking my former boss, Ed Markey. In some ways, this is the second, all this money that's being spent right now that was appropriated by Congress, which, by the way, who knows the next time this will happen. So, we think of this as having one shot to get this right. In some ways, this is a second Telecom Act, right? The 96 Act set up the rules. Ed Markey was the primary author. And now Congress is providing the money, substantial amounts of money, tens of billions of dollars of money to complete the network and bring those opportunities to all. And so I feel a extremely, extremely high responsibility to make sure that the funds are spent well and that we achieve that goal.
Well, that'll have to be the last word. Thank you so much for being with us, Joseph Wender. Reminder to tune in next week, either in Keystone, Colorado for Mountain Connect, or online. You can hear Alan Davidson, and I'll have a chance to interview him. And then next Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern time, join us for kind of a recap of what happened at Mountain Connect and how it impacts all of these funds, Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. But thank you to Joseph Wender for letting us know and dig into the details of the Capital Projects Fund. On behalf of our guest, Joey Wender, I'm Drew Clark, Broadband Breakfast. See you next week. Take care.